For my presentation, I want to talk about disaster tourism. So first, what is a disaster? There are varying definitions of what a disaster is, but Lindell defines it as an actual occurrence that produces casualties and damage at a level exceeding a community's ability to cope. Lindell notes two features of disaster typically included in the varying definitions of disaster. The first feature is that disasters are abnormal events that are out of the norm and are not a common occurrence. The second feature is that the consequences of a disaster are severe enough to require extra community resources during response efforts and the recovery phase. Walton defines tourism as the act and process of traveling away from home and spending time at a given location for recreational and leisure purposes while making use of the available commercial provision of services. Disaster tourism, as explained by Kelman, is specifically traveling to see areas affected by a disaster. Examples of popular disaster tourism sites include Chernobyl, a Ukrainian city where the worst nuclear accident in history occurred, and New Orleans, which is a city majorly impacted by Hurricane Katrina, one of the worst natural disasters in the history of the US. Reasons behind disaster tourism include those out of curiosity. Kalman explains, disaster tourists may feel survivor's guilt or shame, may be interested in the heritage and history of their identity, and may seek novelty and or nostalgia. Kalman states, empathetic reasons are another big cause for disaster tourism, as tourists may travel to disaster sites to show their solidarity with affected groups. Positives of disaster tourism include a collective understanding of why an event took place and what factors contributed to the severity of the situation at hand. Disaster sites can be educational, and disaster tourism may educate people on things such as the potential scope of loss a disaster can produce, what emergency management is and its phases, and disaster risk reduction strategies. Disaster tourists can also support disaster victims. Negatives of disaster tourism include what Kalman describes as rubberneckers and gawkers who may upset disaster victims. Disaster tourists can be a burden to a disaster area because they require basic necessities like food, water, and shelter that could potentially be given to victims, and they may also divert local emergency personnel's attention away from local victims. Disaster zones can also put tourists in danger. In 1980, disaster tourists traveled to Mount St. Helens to see the volcano erupt. Because tourists can be unaware and uneducated on the severity of certain natural disasters, almost half of the 57 deaths at Mount St. Helens were tourists. Finally, disaster tourists may further damage a disaster area. Thank you.